people that neither the Incas nor Spain could conquer. In the 15th century, the Inca Empire was the largest state in the history of the Americas, a political system that had absorbed 12 million people from what is now Colombia in the north to the high deserts of northern Chile in the south. It had conquered the Chimú, the Huari, the Tiwanaku, and dozens of other nations. Its road network stretched more than 23,000 miles. Its administrative machinery could process new conquests, extract labor and food tribute, and incorporate entire civilizations within a single generation. No one in the Western Hemisphere had successfully stopped it. Then it reached the Maule River in what is now central Chile, and it stopped. The people living south of the Maule called themselves the Mapuche, from the words Mapu, meaning land, and Che, meaning people, the people of the land. They were not a centralized empire. They had no single king, no capital city, no administrative bureaucracy, no palace to occupy or treasury to seize. Their political structure was built on the Elof, the clan unit, with Loncos as community leaders and Tokus, elected specifically and only for times of war. When the war ended, the Toki's authority ended with it. This decentralization, which their neighbors might have considered a weakness, turned out to be their most powerful military asset. There was nothing for an invading empire to conquer, no throne to capture, no head of state whose submission would produce the submission of everyone else, no capital whose fall would end the resistance. The Inca understood this eventually after years of campaigning. An army of 50,000 men pushed south into Mapuche territory and fought a battle at the Maule River that lasted 3 days and produced no decisive result. Then the Inca withdrew to the river and stayed there. The Maule became the permanent southern boundary of the largest empire in the Americas. Every other people between Colombia and that river had been absorbed. The Mapuche remained outside. What does it mean that a people without an empire stopped an empire that had conquered everything? And what was it about the Mapuche that made them alone in all of South America? Unconquerable. A river becomes the border the Incas accepted. Sometime between 1471 and 1493, during the reign of the Inca Emperor Tupac Inca Yupanqui, the imperial general Sincharuca led a 6-year campaign southward through Chile that subdued the indigenous peoples of Copiapó, Coquimbo, Aconcagua, and the Maipo Valley, the area around what is now the city of Santiago. These victories followed the standard Inca pattern: superior organization, numerical advantage, the offer of integration into the imperial system in exchange for labor tribute, and military force for those who refused. It worked everywhere. The Picunche peoples of central Chile were absorbed without great difficulty. Then the army turned south and crossed into Mapuche territory. The Mapuche did not fight the same way as the peoples the Inca had previously conquered. They did not build fortified settlements that could be besieged. They did not organize large-scale, set-piece battles that the Inca army's superior coordination could win. They dispersed, regrouped, struck at isolated units, withdrew into the forest and mountainous terrain of the Araucanía, and reappeared somewhere else. When the Incas sent diplomatic envoys asking for submission and tribute in the name of the sun god, the Mapuche sent them back without an agreement. There was no Mapuche ruler with the authority to make such an agreement, even if he had wanted to. At the Maule River, after 3 days of inconclusive battle, the Inca forces halted. Modern historians debate whether this represented a formal decision or simply the practical limit of what the empire was willing to invest in a campaign against a people who offered so little in the way of extractable wealth and required so much in the way of sustained military effort to subdue. The Mapuche had no gold mines the Inca knew about. Their dispersed society could not be taxed through the Inca labor system. The cost-benefit calculation over time did not favor continued advance. Whatever the precise reasoning, the result was the same. The Inca built no roads south of the mall. They established no administrative posts. The mall became the frontier, the only frontier in the entire history of Inca expansion that was drawn not by the edge of the known world, but by the refusal of one people to be absorbed. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Spain builds forts and forces people into mines. In the year 1540, the Spanish conquistador Pedro de Valdivia, an officer from Extremadura in western Spain who had served under Francisco Pizarro during the conquest of the Inca Empire, led an expedition south from Peru into Chile with a force of approximately 150 Spanish soldiers and a larger number of indigenous auxiliaries. He founded the city of Santiago in 1541. He founded Concepcion. He pushed steadily southward, establishing settlements and extending Spanish control over the same territory the Inca had absorbed. The Picuncha and other peoples of central Chile, already weakened by decades of Inca administration, and the European diseases that had arrived with the first explorers, offered relatively limited resistance. Valdivia built forts, Tucapel, Purén, Confines, Arauco, outposts designed to hold the territory between Santiago and the further south he intended to push. In October of 1553, he opened a gold mine at Quillacollo and forced large numbers of Mapuche men to work in it. The Mapuche did not have a tradition of forced labor, unlike the Andean peoples to the north who had operated under the Inca Metai system for generations. They had never worked for anyone. The gold mine at Quillacollo, where men who had lived freely in the forests and valleys of the Araucanía were now compelled to dig in the earth for the benefit of men who had arrived from another continent, was the last provocation. The Mapuche called a council. They discussed what was happening to them and what to do about it. At the end of the council, they elected a toqui, a war leader, for the coming conflict. His name was Caupolicán, described in Spanish sources as a man of extraordinary physical strength. His vice toqui was a younger man named Lautaro. What was unusual about Lautaro's, what made him the most dangerous Mapuche military mind the Spanish would ever face, was where he had spent the previous 6 years. A boy captive returns home, knowing every secret. Around the year 1542, when he was approximately 11 years old, a Mapuche boy named Leftraru, later called Lautaro by the Spanish, was captured during the early phases of the Spanish campaign in southern Chile. He was taken into the household of Pedro de Valdivia himself and put to work as a page and groom. His primary responsibility was the care of Valdivia's horses. For 6 years, Lautaro lived inside the Spanish military world. He watched how the cavalry trained, how they organized their formations, how they responded to threats, what their weaknesses were, and above all, how the horses, the animals that had terrified every other indigenous people in the Americas, actually functioned in combat. A horse, Lautaro observed, tired. A cavalry charge was devastating on the first pass, formidable on the second, and exhausted on the third. The psychological terror of the horse depended on opponents who broke and ran at the first charge. An army that held its ground rotated fresh fighters into the combat in continuous waves and targeted the horses directly rather than the riders could reduce the cavalry advantage to almost nothing. Around 1548 or 1549, When he was approximately 17 years old, Lautaro escaped and returned to his people. He brought with him something no Mapuche military leader had ever possessed: a complete operational understanding of Spanish tactics built from years of direct observation. He taught what he had learned. He trained Mapuche warriors to attack in organized waves. When one group tired, the next pressed the attack, denying the Spanish cavalry the rest it needed between charges. He created the first Mapuche cavalry corps, using horses captured in raids to match Spanish mobility. He redesigned Mapuche combat around the specific vulnerabilities of the people now occupying their land. When the council at Quillacollo elected Caupolicán as Toqui and Lautaro as vice-Toqui in 1553, the Mapuche did not simply have a war leader. They had a military strategist who knew the enemy better than most of the enemy's own officers. Christmas Day delivers Spain its most humiliating defeat. On December 24th, 1553, Pedro de Valdivia, the conquistador of Chile, founder of Santiago, the man who had spent 13 years building Spanish control over a land 3,000 miles long, left the city of Concepcion with 50 cavalry soldiers and traveled south toward the fort of Tucapel. He had received no word from the garrison there, which concerned him. What he did not know was that every message he had sent had been intercepted by Lautaro's men. He was riding toward a trap that had been prepared specifically for him. On Christmas morning, December 25th, 1553, Valdivia arrived at Tucapel and found ruins. The fort had been destroyed. The garrison was gone. As his 50 men stood among the burned timbers trying to understand what had happened, Mapuche warriors emerged from the surrounding forest in the first wave of an attack that had been carefully choreographed. The first wave fought, tired, and was replaced by a second. The second tired and was replaced by a third. Valdivia's cavalry, the decisive weapon of every Spanish military engagement in the Americas, could not be decisive against an enemy that kept coming in rotation. The Spanish broke. Valdivia ordered the retreat. Lautaro himself moved around the Spanish flank and sealed the escape route. Every cavalry soldier was killed or captured. Only Valdivia and the chaplain Pozo, riding the fastest horses, made it to the swampy ground beyond the battlefield, where their horses became mired and the Mapuche caught them. What happened next exists in several versions. The most dramatic: Valdivia offered to withdraw every Spanish settlement from Mapuche territory and deliver large herds of livestock if the Mapuche would let him live. The offer was refused. He was executed. His death, the death of the man who had conquered Chile, on Christmas Day of 1553, was the signal that everything was about to change. A dead general triggers the destruction of 7 cities. For the 45 years after the death of Valdivia at Tucapel, the war in southern Chile ground on in the pattern that would eventually earn it the name the Spanish most dreaded: the Flandes Indiano, Indian Flanders, a reference to the endless, inconclusive war the Spanish crown was simultaneously fighting in the Netherlands. Lautaro was killed by betrayal in April of 1557, ambushed at his encampment on the Mataquito River by Spanish cavalry, under Juan Godinez, after a member of an allied people revealed his location. He was approximately 22 years old. Caupolicán was captured by betrayal in 1558 and executed by impalement at Cañete. The Spanish assumed these deaths would end the war. They did not. Decades of skirmishes followed. The Mapuche adopted horses, Spanish metalworking techniques, and Spanish tactical ideas and combined them with their existing knowledge of the Araucania's terrain. They raided, they ambushed, they evaded large-scale engagements where Spanish artillery and organization would determine the outcome and forced, instead, the kind of dispersed guerrilla conflict where their knowledge of the land negated every Spanish advantage. Philip II of Spain, who had sent some of his best military commanders to Chile to end the war, eventually described it as costing more Spanish lives than any other conflict in the New World. In December of 1598, the governor of Chile, Martín García Oñez de Loyola, the same man who had captured the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, was traveling through Mapuche territory with only 50 soldiers. He camped at Curalaba without defensive precautions. The Mapuche Toki Pelantaru had been watching him. On December 21st, 1598, 300 Mapuche warriors attacked the camp at night. The governor and nearly all his men were killed. It was the second governor of Chile to die at Mapuche hands. Over the next 6 years, the Mapuche destroyed 7 Spanish cities south of the Biobío River, killed more than 3,000 colonists, and captured over 500 women. The Spanish conquest of southern Chile effectively ended. Spain signs a treaty, admitting it cannot win. Between 1598 and 1641, the geography of colonial Chile had been fundamentally redrawn. The Biobío River, which runs roughly from the Andes to the Pacific Ocean in what is now the south-central region of the country, had become a real frontier. Spanish settlements, farms, and forts occupied the territory to the north. The Mapuche's ancestral land, the Wallmapu, extended south. Neither side had the capacity to definitively defeat the other. The Spanish had steel, firearms, horses, and the resources of an empire stretching to Europe. The Mapuche had complete knowledge of their terrain, a military culture refined by 80 years of continuous warfare, and a social structure that made decisive conquest impossible. The Dutch briefly occupied the city of Valdivia in 1643, alarming the Spanish enough that the Viceroy of Peru dispatched 1,000 men on 20 ships to reoccupy and fortify it in 1644. The vulnerability of Chile's southern coast to Spain's European enemies added strategic urgency to an already expensive conflict. Something had to change. In 1641, at a location called Quilín, south of the Biobío, the Spanish governor of Chile and the Mapuche Loncos negotiated and signed the Parlamento de Quilín, one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the Americas. Spain formally recognized Mapuche's sovereignty over all lands south of the Biobío. The treaty prohibited the construction of Spanish forts or missions in Mapuche territory. It established regulated trade in textiles and metals. It defined a patrolled frontier that both sides agreed to maintain. The Mapuche were the only indigenous nation in the entire Western Hemisphere with whom the Spanish crown negotiated a formal treaty recognizing them as political equals. More parlamentos followed across the next century and a half, in 1692, 1726, 1738, and 1793, each one confirming essentially the same reality. 300 years after Hernán Cortés overthrew the Aztec Empire and Francisco Pizarro toppled the Inca, Spain still could not conquer the people south of the Biobío. Chile inherits the war and finally brings artillery. When Chile declared independence from Spain in 1810 and completed the process with military victory in 1818, the new republic inherited the same southern frontier the Spanish had maintained for nearly 200 years. The Biobío River remained the effective boundary between the Chilean state and the independent Mapuche territory, the Wallmapu to the south. For another 40 years after independence, the arrangement persisted. The new Chilean government, focused on establishing its institutions, managing its finances, and consolidating control over the territory it already held, left the Mapuche in effective possession of their ancestral lands. What changed in the 1850s and 1860s was a combination of factors that would prove fatal to Mapuche independence. European immigration, particularly German settlers, was being actively encouraged in southern Chile, and the land they were being invited to settle was Mapuche land. The Chilean economy was expanding, and the agricultural potential of the Araucanía was becoming increasingly attractive to land speculators and farming interests. And critically, the Chilean military now had technologies and organizational capacities that the Spanish had never possessed. Modern rifles, artillery, telegraph communications, and a professional officer corps trained in the military doctrines of mid-19th century European warfare. In 1861, the Chilean military commander Cornelio Saavedra proposed a systematic plan of progressive occupation. Advance south, build a line of forts, then advance again, cutting the Mapuche territory from north to south in controlled stages. The plan was implemented over the following 2 decades. The Mapuche fought back, raiding, ambushing, destroying the new forts, but the combination of modern weaponry, diseases that had reduced their population from approximately 1 million to 150,000 over 3 centuries, and the sheer industrial capacity of a modern state were impossible to overcome indefinitely. By 1883, the last military resistance had been broken. The city of Villarica was refounded on January 1st of that year as the final act of what the Chilean government called the pacification of the Araucanía. The war that had begun in 1536 was over. 300 years of resistance end in defeat. In 1883, after more than 300 years of resistance against the Inca, the Spanish crown, and finally the independent Republic of Chile, the Mapuche were defeated, not by any single battle or decisive campaign, but by the accumulated weight of modern artillery, repeating rifles, epidemic disease, the destruction of their food supplies, and the systematic encirclement of their territory by a state with resources that no guerrilla resistance could overcome indefinitely. The defeat was total in its consequences. The Chilean government issued approximately 3,000 community land grants between 1884 and 1929, the so-called reducciones. Each family received approximately 6 hectares of land per person. Before the Chilean military campaign, the Mapuche had controlled their entire ancestral territory of the Wallmapu, millions of hectares of forest, river valley, coastal land, and mountain terrain that they had held and defended for centuries. After the reducciones, they controlled approximately 500,000 hectares, less than 10% of what had been theirs. The land that had been stripped from them did not sit idle. It was distributed to Chilean and European settler families, converted to agricultural estates, and eventually, in the second half of the 20th century, transferred to the forestry industry. During the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet from 1973 to 1989, government subsidies and tax incentives drove the rapid expansion of industrial tree plantations across what had been Mapuche land. Companies planted Monterey pine, a California species, and Australian eucalyptus in monoculture plantations across hundreds of thousands of hectares. These trees grow fast, produce valuable timber and pulp, and consume enormous quantities of groundwater. Communities that had irrigated their crops from springs and streams for generations found their water sources going dry. The warriors who had stopped the Inca at the Maule River and sent 3 Spanish governors to their deaths were now farmers on tiny plots, watching trees planted by corporations consume the land and the water that had defined their identity since before any of their conquerors arrived. The same fight continues with chainsaws and lawyers. In December of 1997, in the Araucanía region of southern Chile, 3 logging trucks belonging to a forestry company were set on fire near the town of Lumaco. The attack was carried out by Mapuche activists protesting the presence of industrial tree plantations on land they identified as ancestral territory. It was the opening act of what has become known as the Mapuche conflict, a sustained confrontation between Mapuche communities, the Chilean state, and the large forestry companies that today control much of the former Wallmapu. Today, approximately 1.8 million people identify as Mapuche in Chile, roughly 10% of the country's population. They are the largest indigenous group in the country. The primary forestry corporations operating in the former Mapuche territory, Forestal Arauco, controlled by the Angelini family, and Compañía Manufacturera de Papeles y Cartones, controlled by the Mat family, own millions of hectares of pine and eucalyptus plantations in the regions of Biobío, La Araucanía, Los Rios, and Los Lagos. Many of these plantations sit on land where Mapuche communities hold ancestral title documents dating from the 1880s. The pine and eucalyptus consume groundwater at rates that native forests do not. Communities that once had reliable springs and streams now truck in water during dry summers. The monoculture trees provide few permanent jobs. They are planted by machine and harvested by machine, leaving Mapuche families on tiny reducciones, without economic options, except to sell or abandon the land. In October of 2019, when Chile erupted in the largest wave of social protests in the country's history since the end of the Pinochet dictatorship, one of the most prominent symbols carried in the streets of Santiago was the Mapuche Huenufoye flag. The same year, archaeologists working under what is now modern Chile confirmed that Mapuche communities had occupied their ancestral territory continuously for at least 12 centuries before any Inca army reached the Mal River. The fight that began when the Inca tested the border at the Mal River more than 500 years ago has never ended. It has changed its weapons, from stone clubs and obsidian-edged lances to chainsaws and court filings, from ambushes in the Araucanía forest to protests outside the offices of forestry companies in Santiago. But the question at the center of it is the same question it has always been. Who does this land belong to, and who has the right to decide?